Hello, everybody, and welcome to a conversation about navigating the age of chaos. We're starting right on time because very little, very little in this Bonnie future we're going to be talking about, very little starts on time and very little is predictable or understandable, even. So we're here to make sense. We're here to make sense of these things as they go. So, welcome to the conversation. It's all based around the book that Jamay and Angela and I did. It came out just last fall called Navigating the Age of Chaos. And please add your name, your affiliation, your location as we go. This conversation, and it will be pure conversation, no slides here. It's going to be pure conversation among the three of us about our experience since this book went live last fall. And wow, has it it's gone live in such an interesting way, and it's quite a global sense that we're getting about this, and we're going to share with you what we've been learning. But the key element of the topic is to focus on framing the future. And it's one of the big lessons. Many of you are Foresight Essentials practitioners who are trained in our programs. One of the big lessons of more than 50 years of doing this at Institute for the Future, one of the big lessons is if you frame the future correctly, you're going to be more likely to have your preferred future occur. You're going to be more future ready. But if you frame the future inaccurately, or you don't frame it at all, you don't think about the frame. If you frame the future inaccurately, you're going to be less prepared. You're going to be more likely to be blindsided. So, we're going to share with you what we think is the best frame for the next decade. And we're going to go into depth around this in our discussion of the book. And then there'll be time for you to ask questions and conversations. So, first, let me introduce my colleagues. Let's begin with the father of Bonnie, Jamay. Jamay, can you please share kind of what attracted you to this idea of writing a book about Bonnie?
Well, I needed to get it out there, get the word out there. Yeah, I came up with Bonnie back in 2018, and everyone had been telling me since that you need to make this a big deal. You need to get it out there and visible to people. And I didn't know what to do until I talked to Bob, and he just really pointed me in the right direction and allowed me to speak to some interesting people. And voila, the book was the result. But it really was an attempt to tell the story that had been bouncing around in my head for a few years about what I was seeing in the world.
Great. And we're going to come back to what it is were seeing. Our publisher, Barrett Kohler, has been wonderful. And when we went to them, they got it immediately. This is a publisher that's trying to change the world one book at a time. So we fit right into the kind of thing they were looking for. So Angela F. Williams. Angela is somebody I've known for years now, Easter Seals and YMCA, and then running United Way worldwide as you were writing the book. What attracted you, Angela, when we invited you into this conversation?
Well, can I say, Bob, Jermaine's voila just resonated. And it's interesting because, during that period of COVID in 2020, I think the whole world felt something, not only spiritually, emotionally, physically, around us and then in the atmosphere. And we were all struggling to put words to what we were feeling. And we know that language and narrative is extremely important in the human context. So when you reached out to me, Bob, and introduced me to Jemay, and I learned about Bonnie, it just really resonated and gave me the framework, the language, the narrative to begin talking about what we've all been experiencing. And of course, coming from the health and human services sector, to really, really put some framework and language together.
That's great. Thank you. And wow, that perspective was so important because Jamie and I are both futurists. So we're not experts in the present. We're thinking future back about where things are going. But you're grounded. You're grounded and you're globally grounded. So that's really what we were looking for as we invited you into the conversation. What attracted me, and I must admit that I was in the front row as Jamet gave his opening talk about Bonnie in 2018, and I was skeptical. I was a believer in the VUCA frame, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I teach at the Army War College. I teach the new generals as a guest lecturer, and I had a VUCA positive that I was very excited about. But what I realized in the conversations back and forth with Jamet was that VUCA wasn't VUCA enough anymore. We needed more. So he and I began this conversation about a positive Bonnie and what that would mean for leaders. And that's what drew me into the conversation.
And
So
that's what drew me into it as well, because, or at least made it possible for you to translate this idea, this 40-minute talk, into something that would make for a good book,
uh-huh.
and that is what I called at the time the Banny framing was an attempt to talk about what I was the omni crisis, the
Yes.
metapocalypse, or we omnishambles, or whatever people are calling it, that that was starting to happen in the mid 2010s and really hit the ground in 2020 with COVID, but was already on its way
Mhm.
before
Yep.
COVID.
Exactly.
And admit it, Bob, you were more than skeptical. You were downright dismissive when we talked afterwards. But I give you full props on coming around on that and really rethinking your position and what you had and what you could see, what
Yes.
you saw about the future. So I fully applaud you for that, and thank you for it. Um, no, it's just the creating the positive spin, the positive version, not just here are some possible responses, but really framing it with the
Mhm.
BANI.
Yes.
That made the
So,
difference.
so we're going to go into the positive, Bonnie, but I want to pause a little about your comment about pronunciation. Early on, Jamie and I were pronouncing this Banny, Banny, and Angela was out there in the world giving speeches all around the world. I think it was in Poland, weren't you?
Yes.
When you sent us this message back from Poland, and share what you learned as you presented it and called it Banny.
So it was interesting. It was the Eastern European Economic Summit. And um, what I've learned is that language and again, and how you intone things are received differently from different languages and cultures in the ear and the tonality. And as I kept saying Banny, 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 someone said to me afterwards, you sound like you're California American, and this is an Eastern European conference. And what is better for our ear is Bonnie. And I said, oh, well, thank you for that insight. So as Bob says in an email back to them, and we spoke, I said, okay, let's practice. It's Bonnie, Bonnie, Bonnie.
Bonnie, Bonnie,
And here
Bonnie.
we are. Brittle,
And
anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible, Bonnie.
and it's a lot more warm and friendly, I think.
Yes.
So someone commented in the chat already about my background and the Big Bird and the Mickey Mouse on the shelf. There's a story for everything in my study, and as Angela was saying, we're really storytellers. And
Yes.
now that I'm mostly virtual, I'm trying to bring people into my study. Big Bird was from the time I gave a talk on Sesame Street, the Monday after the Connecticut shooting of the school children.
Mm.
And we thought about canceling it, and then we thought, on an awful day like that, what better place to be than on Sesame Street?
Mm.
So I was there with Big Bird that day, and that's my memory of that. The Mickey Mouse is from a custom forecast we did for Walt Disney World right after 9/11. And the forecast was about the future of fun in theme parks. And that Mickey Mouse there is the prototype for what you now have on your smartphones that identifies where you are in the park and where the lines are shorter and tells you your kids jokes as you go along the way. So that's part of the lesson we're bringing you with Bonnie is how can we all be great storytellers? Can we all engage with our own stories, but then listening to others? And this session is going to be very informal. I've got the book in front of me, and you can see all the little notes I have here about things I want to stop in. For those of you who have the book, start off on the table of contents, and we may do responsive readings as we go. But the idea of this is to give you an overview, but focusing on the lessons that we've learned since the book came out. So, Jamea, let's start at the beginning, the origin story. How did Bonnie occur to you first?
Well, IFTF had asked me for its 50-year anniversary event. It had asked me to talk about basically what the future of trust in the international setting would look like.
Mm.
And from that, I started thinking about the various ways in which not just trust, but expectations had been subverted
Mhm.
by so much happening in the world, and how much that seemed to be happening with greater and greater frequency and intensity. And as I was going, I realized, VUCA. Well, VUCA was the language, the common language, but man, we eat VUCA for breakfast these days, and that was the line I used in the talk. That it's so ubiquitous, it's like we're swimming through it. It's hard to differentiate that from anything, So it's VUCA. Everything's VUCA. And as I started to think about what things were really happening, some words kept recurring, some concepts kept recurring: brittleness, non-linearity, and then the anxiety that I was seeing in so much of the online conversations with among younger people,
Mhm.
and then finally just the utter incomprehensibility of it all. And so,
Mhm.
arranging those to make for a pronounceable word, I
Yeah.
came up with BANI, which, as I noted in the original talk, is also the Old Norse word for death. So that felt
Mm,
appropriate.
Mm.
mm,
Um, but it was just a way for me to highlight the transformation or the changes that I could see happening, that we weren't just living in the same world we had been living in a decade before.
yes, yes.
It was different and in a substantive way.
It was different. Yes.
And
And
so,
you go
you
ahead.
know, no, and so from that, that's really, I presented this idea, presented the concept, and framed it in all sorts of internet memes and this is fine
Yes.
dog and all that. But really, it was a sense of, we are seeing something not just disruptive, but potentially catastrophically disruptive in a way that we simply do not have the experience with.
Yes, yes. And of course, then you wrote your article on Medium, and
Right,
that was really what was the springboard into the book. And I remember
right.
as I was sitting there in the front row, and you said, you know, this new world, this emerging world eats VUCA for breakfast, and I'm thinking to myself, well, B is for Bob, and B is now for boring if I don't get with it. so, so, so it was really challenging my assumption because for me, VUCA was a good frame when we did the kind of post 9/11 world, and I'm not a
It
military guy,
was.
but it
It
was a
was.
framing that started in the late '80s, and it actually stuck for quite a while. But it
Well,
but it just wasn't
Bob, can
it
you
just
say
wasn't
what
enough.
VUCA is, just in case people don't know what VUCA is?
Sure, it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And at Institute for the Future, we flipped that positive and said, well, volatility yields to vision, uncertainty yields to understanding, complexity yields to clarity, and ambiguity yields to agility. So those things are still true at some level. But the key point about this that you made early on, Jameh, is that knowability, that's what's changed. It used to be in the VUCA world,
Yeah.
we could assume that if only we had the right experts or the right data, we could know what's going on. But the
Mhm.
framing you introduced did not assume that.
right,
Mhm.
right.
Yeah.
And VUCA was a very useful framing for when it came out. I mean, think about what the early '90s, what that world was like. The end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the emergence of the World Wide Web as a real
Yep.
manifestation of the internet. The change, the shift from the Reagan Bush years to the Bill Clinton years, in the U.S. Just the transformations that were happening all over the world. It seemed like it was a world that, as you said, that was knowable.
Yep.
That
Mhm.
yes, it was volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous, and this is really exciting, but we can understand it. We just put the effort in with a little gumption, we can understand it.
Yep.
And that just didn't feel real any
Right.
longer.
Mhm.
So, Angela, when we began the conversation with you, you were in the midst of transforming United Way worldwide, and we were working with you, and I talked to your rising star leaders. We were having
Yes.
conversations, but I do remember the first time we introduced Bonnie to you. We were calling it Banny, but that whole concept, it wasn't really a surprise to you at all. You were just saying, "Hey, that's what we're experiencing."
Yes, that's absolutely right. And so, Bob, one of the things you said earlier is about future back thinking. And when you said that, the thought came to my mind: the future is right now.
Hmm.
And so in the health and human services space, that means those of us that are working in communities and touching individuals and families and actually working within or outside of systems that affect individuals, families, and communities. Again, going back to 2020, and as Jemay said, you don't you we used to think we knew the world and knew how to handle on things, and we are now in this new era that we don't have that knowledge and knowing, and yet individuals wake up every morning trying to figure out, how do I survive? How do I even thrive?
Hmm.
And how do we meet those aspirations that those people wake up with every morning, given our context, at a very micro level and at a very global level? So, one of the things that I thought was so important was to partner with the Institute for the Future to develop a curriculum to train our next generation leaders in the health and human services space, because I wanted them to have the skill sets that all of you have and the training that you all have gone through, to be able to ensure that humanity is okay. I
Hmm.
just want to make sure human beings are okay, families are
Yes.
okay. And then how do we engage in these systems in a way to um, live and operate in this
Hmm.
unknowable world?
Hmm. Great. And in chapter 11, we kind of summarize those leadership lessons that came out of the work with Angela and other groups around the world, where I hope we get to that some today. But I want you to share, Angela, as you were on the around the world while we were writing. And I remember we had this game that we were always playing about, where is Angela today? And it could be anywhere in the world. There's kind of, where is Angela? Where's Angela? But you were all around when you were introducing this concept. Were there any kind of typical reactions that you ran into with people on the ground? Kind of experience. Many of these people are experiencing crises as you're showing up. But how did you find this way of framing the future, or it was actually framing what they were experiencing in the future now? But just tell us a little bit about what that was like as you kind of go in and introduce this kind of futuristic concept.
We mentioned Poland, which was the Eastern European Economic Summit. Also, I had the opportunity in June of last year to go to Australia and to present the book's concepts at one of the universities, and then with the Social Impact Center at that university. And in attendance were a number of leaders of family foundations and philanthropists, and they really appreciated the notion of the book, because again, every country, every community is currently experiencing the world slightly differently, but yet they gravitate towards, yes, we know that our systems are brittle, we see them breaking down and not delivering as they are supposed to. Yes, we have our students in our colleges and universities that are anxious. Yes, we see in our indigenous communities and in our underserved communities a high level of anxiety, or our younger generation. So, again, those four concepts, the B, the A, the N, and the I, translate culturally as well as language wise.
Yes. And I think this is a great point you're making, Angela. And as you all working with us today are figuring out how to use the Bonnie concept, I think it's really important to have the kind of visionary perspective like Jamea is constantly providing, but also the on the ground perspective, the
Mhm.
strategic perspective that Angela is providing, and have both of those perspectives there simultaneously. So often futurists are just kind of out there in the future, and then you kind of leave people on their own. We're trying very
Mhm.
hard in this book to frame the future, but then help people make sense of it, even
Mhm.
though, as we say in the subtitle, even though a lot of it doesn't make sense. So
Mhm.
it's a question, you still have to act anyway. So
Right.
Jamea, let's begin the conversation. We only have limited time today, but let's go through the Bonnie frame, both the, as you call, the original recipe Bonnie, and the positive Bonnie. Let's begin with brittle and just
Sure.
frame that for us quickly, and then Angela, maybe you and I can start to bring out, well, what's the flip of that? You know, how do we flip that positive? So Jamie, you start, and let's do a little popcorn back and forth.
Well, actually, just before that, I do want to point out that something that Angela was saying really does underscore something that has become kind of the slogan for the book. The future is uncertain, and yet we must act.
Hmm.
And that really is the underlying engine for so much of this.
So much. Yes.
Uh, Brittle. Okay, brittle is simply the idea that systems can appear strong, can even function well, until an inflection point happens and it collapses. Something can look strong, can be strong, and then fall apart very quickly. That strength is often an illusion. And what we're seeing around the world in such a wide variety of systems, from climate to politics, are these systems that appear to be functional and strong, suddenly and quite often disastrously collapsing.
Hmm. So when you hear that, we struggled a lot with what's the B, what's the positive B, and we ended up coming up with bendable. So
Come on.
can you react to that, Angela? How does bendable play in your on the ground groups?
I'll give you going back to Australia. I'll just give you a really simple example. So, in a number of countries, they actually have these little boxes that people will place in their yard where they'll put books in them, and free for people to walking their dogs or strolling around. They'll go in that little box on the lawn and pull out a book and take it. And they have that in the U.S., but they also have that in Australia. And during COVID, rather than putting books in, and because people were on lockdown, they put canned goods. So it's
Oh,
like using an existing system and using it differently and making it bendable to meet the moment.
that's so useful. Yes. And what we say is you want to be bendable within a resilient clarity story. And we had a great advantage working with United Way because Angela, you had developed there a very clear clarity story. So it isn't bendable like the cartoon character Gumby, where there's just blendable in a flexing way. It's bendable within a clarity story. And then we were really lucky as we wrote the book, just as we were in the middle of writing, Judith Moskowitz at Northwestern published some work about how to use psychological coping methods for
Mhm.
health crises. And these were unsolvable crises. So, like your partner has dementia or terminal cancer diagnosis. And Judith did this amazing review of all the different techniques for coping. And we started from those and then refined them in a future back way. And I'm just going to share one for bending the idea of expressing gratitude.
Mhm.
The act of expressing gratitude helps your bendability, helps your response to brittle systems, because brittle systems don't fail gracefully. They tend to shatter.
Mhm.
Right.
So they don't fail gracefully. So you need support around you at the time. And so often we get sucked in to the
Mhm.
negatives that we don't have time to record the positives. So as we were writing the book, I started writing a gratitude journal where every night I wrote down 3 things that I was grateful for. That sounds really simple, but it's the discipline of doing it every day that had a remarkable impact.
Actually, Bob, it was the coping framing
Hmm.
that really clinched it for me with the positive Bonnie approach we were taking in the book. And rather than thinking at the same scale,
Hmm.
thinking about, well, when we're talking about, brittle systems like, oh no, the an Antarctic ice shelf or the
Mhm.
somebody's economic system, and then how do we talk about bendability and resilience at that scale? Well, you don't. You talk about how we develop the capacity to cope.
Hmm.
Talk about how do we develop the
Yes.
capacity to figure out how to respond.
Yes.
And so
Mhm.
just that shift in perspective, that shift in scale, shift in framing made a real difference to me in the
It
creation of the book.
It sure did. And, this is the hardest book that I've ever been involved in writing, the hardest in terms of coping. It was really hard on me psychologically. I wasn't sleeping as well. It was
Mhm.
upsetting. It was upsetting to talk to Jamais about
Thank you.
many things. It's just something that we have to learn how to live with. But coping is the beginning. And I remember, Angela, you and I and Janae were all impatient with the word coping. We were saying, well, you got to do more than cope. You got to be resilient. And resilience was another word that popped out a lot. But you can't be resilient unless you're coping.
Right.
You
Mhm.
kind of need that as the price of entry. So let's go on to the word anxious. Now, Janae, you've told me that when you give talks about Bonnie, anxious is what everybody pipes up to.
Right. Because I think it's something of a universal feeling, especially right now. Yeah, although when the origins of this, the inclusion of anxious came from really back in 2018, looking at various online, conversation sites like Reddit, and just the discussions that people in their, late teens and 20s and early 30s were having about their lives. This anxiety kept coming through, and so um, that was where it started, but especially post COVID. Anxious has become the watchword globally, however it might get translated into individual languages. And that's something that's actually been really absolutely remarkable for me, is just how well the broader Bonnie concept has
Yes.
translated around the world. Yeah, I had an inkling that that I was on the right track, even back in 2018 when I gave that talk, because although some people in the audience were kind of iffy about it, the folks who were visiting from Brazil were
I
just
got it.
completely enthusiastic, said, yes, you have it. This is exactly right. This is the world.
I got it.
And in the first few years of the spread of the Bonnie concept, the people from the global south were far more likely to pick up on Bonnie than folks in Europe and the United States.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, eh, and across the spectrum of cultures, across the world, anxiety is the word that immediately connects with people, and
Right.
it makes it clear that this is not just about how big systems work. It's also about how
Yes.
we as humans work.
Exactly. And we say in the book, we quote Robert Rosen's book, Just Enough Anxiety, because anxiety itself is not bad. It's chronic
Mhm.
anxiety, it's
Mhm.
debilitating anxiety that's bad. And I think that's what we're seeking is kind of just enough anxiety. And Angela, in the chapter talking about positive, attentive as our response to anxiety, we talk about United Way's anxious turnaround. And I wonder if you could tell the story about your 211 helpline, because to me, the 211 helpline is a great example of both being bendable, but then being attentive to people's practical needs, but in the context of this bigger clarity story you were telling.
Yes. One thing I will say, just to bring the point home that you two have just spoken about, when it comes to anxiety, I think out of all four concepts, that's the one that where emotion and you actually physically feel it in your
Right,
body, and I think that's why it
right.
resonates with all of us. And it's an emotion word. So I'm glad you brought up the 211 example. 211 in the U.S. and Canada is the National Health and Human Services Hotline that was founded about 40 years ago by United Way. And it is similar to 911, but it is for non emergencies. The 211 call centers across Both countries take in thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of calls a day, and especially as an example, there were wildfires in Los Angeles last year, and as you can imagine, people were frantically calling. Their houses were on fire. They've lost everything. They had no place to go. They had need of shelter, and so the 211 Los Angeles system was overwhelmed with calls, and they were able to call 211 systems in other states on the East Coast to take the overflow of calls and to be able to use an existing system to care for people and their individual needs. And we're immediately, with the partnership through Airbnb, able to place thousands of people in housing. So an anxious system that's overloaded, that's bendable and usable to meet the emotional and physical needs of individuals that were going through a crisis at that moment.
Interesting. Interesting. So that really is an example of being attentive, but you're also responding in practical ways. So let's go on to nonlinear. Jamay, defining nonlinear.
Well, nonlinear was the first element that hit me because something that I've been writing about climate and speaking about climate disruption and its impact on humanity for a couple of decades now. And one of the things I discovered, or that I learned a little while back, was about climate hysteresis, which is the
Yes.
lag between cause and effect. There is about a 10 to 20-year lag between changes in the level of atmospheric uh, greenhouse gases and changes to temperature and precipitation. And that applies both directions. So when we add more and more greenhouse gas material into the atmosphere, the increase in warming hits about a decade later. But also means that when we stop, when we eventually stop putting any greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, any anthropogenic greenhouse gases, there will continue to be warming, not just warm temperatures, but additional warming for another decade at least. And that struck me as being not just a geophysical question, but a political one. Because
Yeah.
if you convince people to make the radical changes in their lives that would be necessary in order to stop putting so much greenhouse gas into anthropogenic greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, and then nothing happens. It
Mm,
doesn't just not get better; it continues to get worse.
yeah.
And that struck me as being a really important issue. And from that snowballed out this larger observation that so much of what we're seeing around us is this nonlinear relationship between cause and effect, either in terms of time, like the
Mhm.
hysteresis, or in terms of scale. Making an offhand comment online can turn into a
Mhm.
massive political crisis. A
Mhm.
millions of dollars spent on a political or advertising campaign can have no effect in the populace. And so
Right.
this idea that what we are doing doesn't necessarily scale to the effect
Yes.
we have. And then the observations about inequality and the power that a very small number of people can have to affect literally billions of us around the world. That just all seems to come together in this concept that, it's kind of a math word, but it is something that is really, for me, the most important element in
Yeah.
all this is this disconnection
Yes.
between how we act and what we get.
Yes. Yes. So the positive, Bonnie, in this case is neuroflexible. And we struggled with this word a lot, but we wanted to bring the neuroscience into it. And a lot of the issue is expectations. If you expect things to be linear and they're not, it just throws you completely off. But I wonder, Angela, as you're out in the field working with local, and I should point out that United Way is a federated organization. So you have local authority all around the world. You don't just tell people what to do, and they
Yes.
do it. You've got to be a negotiator, a charismatic leader that brings this clarity and then facilitates. But as you were, the line we used was you need to teach your brain new tricks.
Yes.
And you did that so often, and we bring out a number of the stories where you or a board member or a local staff person had just a different way of thinking about things. Can you just share a little bit about what that was like in the field?
When we think about the neuroflexibility, the way I look at it is you can't keep trying to put a square peg in a round hole and trying to force it in and thinking eventually this is going to work, because clearly it's not. And being on the ground and in communities, the neuroflexibility means not going in with a preconceived notion of how to solve the problem. Rather, this also ties into the A, but it's rather sitting in the room with the people being affected to listen, learn, and then realize that they actually have the solutions for what is going on in their community. And that neuroflexibility is, I've been trained a certain way, I've seen it work in a certain pattern in other communities, but that's not necessarily the case. And so every community is different, the nuances are different. One quick thing I will just share with you about neuroflexibility is a recent example during hurricane season over the last couple of years. And hurricanes, for example, really hit Asheville, North Carolina, and they weren't prepared for it. It's not something, it was very uncommon. And in the hills of North Carolina, there's a different culture and way of relating to each other. And so you had a federal agency come in to help deliver services to get people housed, to get the infrastructure back up and running, yet they weren't able to connect to the people in Appalachia because they didn't understand that the prescription that the agency used every other place did not work in Appalachia.
Wow.
And so there's a way of being flexible as a leader and as
Right.
a person that's tapped into local communities. That's important.
Right. Wow, that's so important. And the subtitle of this chapter 8 is Practical Improvisation. And one of the positive discoveries out of this is it was really discouraging to do the chapter on the difficulties of nonlinear for the reasons Jemay was talking about. But it turns out there's this long history of improvisation methods that comes from theater and comes from comedy, comes from international relations, the yes and methodologies. So we embraced that, the importance of improvisation. And I've realized I've worked with a number of senior executive teams using the book since the book came out. Pretty much all of them are also doing improv now. They're also doing improv. So the techniques of improv here are very relevant, and they do apply to ourselves as we're trying to cope with these
Mhm.
situations and trying to engage with them in a positive way. So let's end on interconnected. This is the and it's really incomprehensible yields to interconnected. But describe incomprehensible for us, Jamay, because in a way this is the hitter. And we gave people warnings as they read these chapters to kind of fasten your seatbelts now. But introduce incomprehensible for us.
Well, in the chapter on incomprehensible, I really start things light by talking about nuclear war. Um, it's really incomprehensible to me was a way of politely talking about essentially the world being all of it being a WTF experiment or environment. Um, it's not so much a question of not understanding what is happening, not understanding the processes or the physics or whatever. It's about not being able to understand why is all of this happening like this, and this question of what the heck is going on
Mhm.
just keeps recurring across the spectrum of disciplines and issues. And for me, incomprehensible was for me felt like a good way to describe it. I've gotten a lot of pushback from people
Mhm.
saying, how dare you call something incomprehensible? With enough effort, human beings can understand anything. Well,
Mhm.
yes, you can understand the process, but can you understand the why?
Yeah.
And so, incomprehensible, whether we're talking
Mhm.
about, thinking the unthinkable, like Herman
Mhm.
Kahn did back in the early 60s and talking about nuclear war,
Yes.
or we're talking about taking some kind of potentially radical steps around climate because we aren't doing not taking the sensible steps.
Yeah.
It all feels like, why is this happening?
Yes.
And it was really that feeling of just what the heck is going
Yeah.
on that drove the creation of this
Yeah.
chapter.
And things just don't make sense. And we've got to
Mhm.
have our expectations around that. Can you
Yep.
tell quickly the Stanislav Petrov story? I realize we told that in the neuroflexible chapter, but it applies in incomprehensible too. And it's just such a powerful image, and it does link back to the nuclear war theme.
Well, Stanislav Petrov was a Soviet Union air defense officer back in the 1980s. And some of you may be elderly enough to remember Korean Airlines 007, Flight 007, that was shot down by the Soviet Union over the
Mhm.
Kamchatka Peninsula in
Mm.
1983. Well, a couple of weeks after that, so if you remember, the tensions were remarkable. The
Mhm.
U.S. was actually starting up a war game in Central Europe. The Soviets were behaving like the Soviets did, and it was remarkable just how close it all felt to nuclear war. And 2 weeks after the shoot down, Stanislav Petrov was on duty at his air defense station, and he wasn't supposed to be there that night, but he took on somebody else's uh, spot. He had written the guide for air defense officers about how to respond to an alert. And it basically boiled down to send it up the chain of command. And knowing
Mhm.
that at the time, the uh, the Soviet policy was essentially massive retaliation. So
Mhm.
they got an indication of any kind of attack, they would throw back everything.
Mhm.
And very likely the US would in turn throw back everything.
Mm.
And so 2 weeks later, he gets this alert showing up on his radar. Ping, there's a launch of a US nuclear missile. Ping, another, and eventually there's signs of 5 nuclear missiles heading from the United States towards the Soviet Union. Now, he knew what to do, what he was supposed to do, what the checklist said, what the rules said. But he also knew that the context mattered, and he knew that they had just put up a new satellite warning system a few months earlier, and he didn't really trust all of these computer notification systems, and he decided to sit on it, to just not send it up the chain of command. And about a half hour later, it turned out, oops, sorry, it was just a satellite identifying a reflection of the sunlight on the clouds. No big deal, nothing to worry about.
Amazing. So what it
And
mean? Oh, sorry.
I don't know, just to say, and he did the right thing, obviously, and we're still here.
Mhm.
Uh, but he also got reprimanded for not doing the paperwork properly, for not doing what he was supposed to do,
Mhm.
and he eventually got a uh, he was discharged a less than honorable discharge, so not a dishonorable discharge, not a red mark on his record, but a just okay, you're out, and
Yeah.
retired. Died about 10 years ago, and he literally saved the world
Mhm.
by making
Mhm.
the improvisational choice, by making the unexpected choice, because it just didn't make sense
Yes.
what was happening.
Yes.
And he chose, rather than follow the rules, follow the required steps, to step back
Yes.
and think.
Yes, and it's
Mhm.
so that story is so powerful now as generative AI becomes more powerful, and the question becomes, what can humans do best? What can computers do best? And how do they partner in different ways? Um, Angela, from your experience on this interconnected, wow, your United Way is all about interconnection. so, so you a lot of what you're doing, I think, is helping people feel interconnected. And in the face of incomprehensible, that becomes even more meaningful, right? Mm.
Mhm. Yes, and in fact, as you all were talking, again, I go back to human connection, and relationship matters and context matters,
Yes.
and that's where, at least in the health and human services space, when are clear things aren't making sense, um, where they seem incomprehensible, we have to go back to old school. Old school is, I'd love to talk to you, look you in the eye,
Yes.
have a relationship with you, understand what your values are, and don't presume the negative first. And I
Yes.
think that's tying into the story that Jermaine just gave us.
Yes, it is so much. Thank you. And the final thing I'd mention about interconnection and incomprehensible, going back to the coping um, challenges and Judith Moskowitz's research, one of the things that she emphasizes is noticing your personal strengths.
Mm.
Because in the face of incomprehensible, we all feel stupid. We all feel stupid, but stupid people aren't usually empowered. So even if you don't feel smart, you should be able to appreciate what you do know. And here, it's not only a gratitude journal, it's a positive journal. Write down the positive things that you've done today and, set attainable goals. Kind of imagine yourself as succeeding to the extent you can, but so much of it is about expectations. So we only have about 15 minutes left. There's fascinating questions that are coming in here, and I'm going to respond to a few of them. Just as we're kind of wrapping up the presentation part of this, Jamie introduced to us the last chapter, the next to the last chapter actually, that talks about the tools that we're giving, the mapping new reality tools, but also hint at the discussion guide that you were involved in creating, because this is a takeaway tool set for those of you in the seminar.
So the one of the things I wanted to do from early on in the creation of this book was to really talk about foresight and scenario thinking, because that's what I do. I really try to look at the world from the perspective of someone who can see not just a single future, but really what that spread of possibility, what that cone of possibility might be, and to try to translate into the Bani language of how do we talk about foresight? How do we talk about storytelling? One of the things that I write about there is actually based on a talk I gave a while back. Is that the traditional scenario beginning line of "This is a world in which" is very much the futurist version of Once Upon a Time. Not because it's a mythical fairy tale, but because it's a way of setting the stakes, saying these are your expectations. What I'm going to tell you is not reality at the moment, but is a possibility. It is something to think about and really see if you can integrate into your lives today. And
Mhm.
so there's the chapter on foresight and storytelling, the chapter on anticipation and what that really means. I say in there that I often talk about futurism or foresight as anticipatory history, because
Yes,
we look ahead with the same tools that we use to look back.
yes.
And
Mm.
then at the very end of the book, we offer up a set of discussion questions, both for individuals and for groups, and whether it's a boardroom or a classroom,
Mhm.
to really think about what does this mean for you? What do all of the points that we talked about in terms of brittleness or neuroflexibility or interconnectedness, what do these mean to you?
Yes,
And what do they mean to the group of people that you are connected to? And
yes,
how do you integrate that thinking into your day-to-day practices?
yes.
And that's really what we want people to come away with, is a sense not just that a better world is possible, not just that, yes, we know things are really messed up, but there are ways of coping, ways of dealing with it. It's also, here's a way to integrate that into your lives, and
Yep.
not just as an academic exercise, but as a day-to-day practice.
Yes. Yes, and I love the
Mm.
description there you have of scenario planning, and you are the best scenario writer I've ever worked with. So this is really sharing from the master, and it's got a good summary of how to do scenarios in the Bonnie context. How to frame them and map them. Angela, I'm going to ask you the first question from the group, which is about how to scale the Bonnie framework, how to scale it across an organization. But before I do, I'm going to do a quick intro to chapter 11, which is on leadership. And it kind of frames your answer in the sense that we have leadership strategies that you and Jemay and I developed, things like thinking future back, telling authentic stories that flip Bonnie positive, developing leadership skills that match the Bonnie future, organizing with clarity of direction, but flexibility of execution. That's really so important. And I think you did it so well in the context of a federated organization where you can't really just tell people what to do. And it's really important. There was also a question about the risks of certainty. You've got a whole bunch of people who jump into the Bonnie world and say, "Oh, I've got the answer," and they oversimplify it. You can have clarity, and you should have clarity. You can't have certainty. Certainty
Mhm.
is dangerous. You need to track and map signals, and you learn all about in the Foresight Essentials program. You learn all about tracking signals. You need to work within legal, ethical, and moral. We refer to them as bounce ropes, not as guardrails, because it's really too early with many of these tech things. It's too early to have guardrails, but you do
Yes.
need stanchions, and that's your clarity. And finally, practice frequent scenario gaming with these Bonnie variants. But Angela, what advice do you have to the participants here about scaling the Bonnie concept within, very large organization like you were running?
So, thanks, Bob, for that question. And we at United Way Worldwide partnered with the Institute for the Future to create this whole curriculum for our next generation leaders. And the foresight thinking and the tools that all of you have gone through and taken has great. I think what the book does is it's another layer to your future foresight thinking and tools. And what the book offers is, again, the language and the framework to use. That can, when we think about taking things to scale, it gives us the basic elements. But of course, given culture, language, etc., there's enough flexibility in that concept, the negative and the positive Bonnie, to be able to customize in a way that makes the organization and the people, most importantly, that use the framework more effective. And so that's what I say to everyone: simplify it as much as possible and give enough bendability and room for people to apply
Yes,
it in a way that makes sense.
yes. And have you found that they're now using the Bonnie language?
What I've yes, it's so what if as part of our next generation leaders program at United Way, a number of the young people have been exposed to the Bonnie concept. And I will tell you though, what's really interesting is a number of them were came into this world and are already pre-wired to act
Wow,
as leaders and facilitators of Bonnie without even knowing it. And
so
that's
interesting.
something that I think that we all need to pay attention to. There are some of us as leaders or rising leaders or as coaches or executives that are pre-wired to already move and act and
Yes.
respond in this manner. But now we have the framework and language to explain who we are, why we show up the way that we do, and our worldview.
Yes. To me, that's so satisfying when you're not just introducing a new concept, you're introducing a concept that resonates with what they're already experiencing, but it helps them express them and more importantly helps them empower themselves to do something more. We've got a question that's fascinating, and thank you for submitting questions. Please keep doing that. Fascinating question about the simple fix that I wish you could respond to, Jamé, and I will too. But we see in the Bonnie future, people are just urgently wanting a simple fix.
Mm.
They want a simple fix. There isn't a simple fix. So we have to somehow frame that in a way that empowers people without kind of shutting them down, but yet doesn't overpromise. But kind of how do you react to the, let me just call it the simple fix mentality?
Um, well, I think one important step in the reaction is to acknowledge the desire for a simple fix, but also
Yes.
to really emphasize that what we're looking for is a set of fixes, a set of steps that each individually may be simple, but we're looking for how do they come together. The power doesn't come from a particular individual action. It comes from how they combine. Whether we're talking about people or communities or talking about sciences, interdisciplinarity is the core of the response to a Bonnie world.
Yes.
And so a simple fix can only be meaningful if it's part of a larger, probably more complex, but still, it's still achievable in parts, achievable in components. Don't try to eat the whole thing at once. Take simple bites, but let those combine, let those work together in order to create something much bigger.
Mm, got it. Got it. Interesting. Um, so this is one thing I'm most concerned about, and it's kind of a final thought I'd like to leave you with, and I'm going to give space for Angela and Jemay to do that too. This Bonnie future, it will reward clarity, but it will, in the long run, it will punish. It'll punish certainty. It'll punish the simple fix. It may not happen in the short run. It may get rewarded in the short run, but in the long run, it's going to punish certainty. So you need clarity. You can't have certainty. We do get a question here, and I'd like to all of us to reflect. It's not really a question as much as a comment, but it does trouble me. You remember as we were writing, Angela and Jemay, there was this kind of constant tension. Is this a positive book? Is it a negative book? And actually, it's both. It's both. But it is a book with hope. It is a book with hope. And I guess that's where I'd like to end this in response is kind of how do we see, we've called it at the Institute a discipline of hope or a kind of practice of hope or an exercise of hope. But how do you see this playing out in a time where despair is much more common than hope? But I wonder, maybe Angela, just start with you because you're part of the background. I didn't talk. You're trained as an attorney. You also went to divinity school, so you may be unusually qualified to respond to this.
Yeah, thank you. I love that question because as you were going through the framing of it, setting it up, I was thinking about the fact that life is a journey. And going back to even Jermaine's comments about simple fixes. And so one simple fix upon another moves us along in this journey that we find ourselves in called life. And so recognizing that also one of the things that in the Bible, Christian Bible, it talks about in the book of Ecclesiastes that for everything there's a time and a season, and also there's nothing new under the sun. So even though we might find ourselves in an incomprehensible world, that was centuries ago as well. We don't control everything, even though we might try to on an individual or personal level, much less on a system wide level. But what we do is continue to embrace the language and the tools necessary not to
Mhm.
just survive, but also to thrive. And so I do believe that this is a hopeful book and that the tools I hope that people will find towards the back of the book and the discussion questions will help them, even in small groups or larger groups, wrestle with
Yes.
where are we now and what is our future.
Yes. Jemay, do you have a benediction?
Yes, I do actually, and my reference, if Angela talks about the Bible, I'm going to mention the movie Deadpool and Wolverine, um, because at one point the character Deadpool makes a reference that hope is an educated wish,
Mm,
and I really like that framing. It's that it's possible. You don't know if it will happen, but you know that it's possible. And for me, that is the core hopefulness of the book, is recognizing that we know what to do. We have ways of responsibly responding to all of the variety of crises and problems and challenges ahead of us. And humans are remarkably good at that. I spent a lot of time in the conclusion talking about the kinds of extinction events that the planet has gone through.
hmm
There was something that happened about 300 million years ago that scientists called the Great Dying. That's how big of an extinction event the planet has dealt with. But humans have actually gone through their own near extinction events a couple of times over the past couple 100,000 years. Humanity was brought down to about 100 quote unquote breeding pairs, just a few hundred people. And all of the 9 billion or so people on the planet now come from that small group of survivors. We are a remarkably hardy and resilient people. Our civilization is built on this capacity to be resilient. And so the hope that I have, the educated wish that I have, is that we recognize, knowing we know what to do. We just need to take the steps to do it.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And finally, we have in the book the practices that you can employ organizationally, the practices that you can employ individually. But the surprise to me is the value of repetition, the value of repetition over and over and over again. As Jamay said, as Angela said, we know what to do at an individual level. We've got a pretty good idea at the organizational level. Thinking future back helps us, the Bonnie framing helps us, but we have to practice that in our own lives every day in a repetitive way in order to get the kind of results that we're hoping for. So thank you for gathering. I hope you all enjoy the book, and thank you, Jamay. Thank you, Angela, for all you've done to make this a success.
And thank you, Bob. And thank you, IFGF, for putting this together.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It was wonderful. Thanks everyone for
Okay.
joining us.
Bye bye.